Would somebody else like to read? We have about 5 other students online, mashallah. I think each of us should take a turn reading it once.
I don't know if people have mic privilege.
Resto, how about you, brother?
Salaam alaikum. Yeah, I'll take a turn with you. You go ahead and then I'll take the next one.
Okay. Anybody else? Abdul Rahman, Hanif. Okay, I'll go ahead and read again. And then Resto, you're next, okay? Allah has established the creation of the universe and renews it. Allah Ta'ala has established wujud by his words. That is because Allah is real. He is the real. Allah Ta'ala has established that his existence He Ta'ala has established that his existence is continuous after time, al-Baqi, by his words, and rely upon the living who will never die. He Ta'ala has established that his existence is unlike his creation, mukhallif li khalqihi. By his words, there is nothing like him. He Ta'ala has established that his existence is independent, al-Ghani. By his words, Allah is the rich beyond dependence. He Ta'ala has established that his existence is one alone, al-Wahid. By his words, say he is Allah, is one alone. He Ta'ala has established that his existence is omnipotent, Qadir. By his words, verily Allah has power over all things. Is that Qadir or Qadir? Sheikh Yusuf.
In the Quran, it says it's Qadir.
Okay.
وَعَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ.
Yeah. It's spelled Qaadir on here. Okay. Allah Ta'ala has established that he has will, murad. By his words, he does what he wills. He Ta'ala has established that he is all-knowing, al-alim. By his words, verily Allah knows all things. He Ta'ala has established that he is living, al-hayy. By his words, he is the living. He Ta'ala has established that he is all-hearing, sami, as-sami, and all-seeing, al-basir. By his words, I hear and I see. Allah Ta'ala has established that he is a speaker, mutakallim, by his words, and Allah spoke to Moses directly. Allah Ta'ala has established that he chooses in doing a thing or leaving it undone by his words, and your Lord creates what he wills, and he alone chooses. Alhamdulillah. Okay, going back to page 1, inshallah. I am page 9. Okay, Brother Resto, you're up, inshallah.
There's nothing being shown on the screen.
You're not seeing the screen?
No.
Oh no, nobody can see the screen.
We can see the screen, but it's the fill-in screen. It's not the book.
Okay, let me see why. Hold on a sec. A moment. Share screen, window, Chrome tab. Okay, share. All right, how about now?
Yeah, we can see the screen now.
Okay, Jazakallah khair.
Okay.
Okay. Bismillah.
So we're reading the whole thing twice, just to make sure.
Yeah.
Okay, no problem. All right. Allah Ta'ala established the creation of the universe by His words, and He is the one who begins creation and then renews it. He Ta'ala has established His existence and absolutely necessary, wajib al-wajud, by His words. That is because Allah, He is real. I don't got to move. All right. He Ta'ala established that His existence is before time. Qadim, by His words, He is the first. He Ta'ala has established that His existence is continuous after time, walking by His words, and rely upon the living who will never die. He Ta'ala established that His existence is unlike His creations, by His words. There is nothing like Him. He Ta'ala has established that His existence is independent, al-Ghani, by His words, and Allah is the rich beyond dependence. He Ta'ala established that His existence is one, alone, wahid, by His words, saying, He Allah is one alone. He Ta'ala has established that His existence is omnipotent, qadir, by His words, verily Allah has the power over all things. He Ta'ala established that He has will, murad, by His words, He does what He wills. He Ta'ala has established that He is all-knowing, alim, by His words, very Allah knows all things. He Ta'ala has established that He is living, hay, by His words, He is the living. He Ta'ala has established that He is all-hearing, sami'u, and all-seeing, basir, by His words, I hear and I see. He Ta'ala has established that He is a speaker, mutakalim, by His words, and Allah spoke to Moses directly. He Ta'ala has established that He chooses in doing a thing or leaving it undone by His words, and your Lord creates what He wills, and He alone chooses.
Jazakallah khair.
Yeah, I was going back to your question, Aliyah, with regard to it. So Sheikh Uthman in the Arabic, he says that Allah is Qadir, but he uses the proof of the Quran, which is that in Allah ala kulli shayin qadir.
Okay.
Right? So a better translation would be QADIR.
Okay, Jazakallah khair.
It would be QADIR. Yeah. And interestingly enough, I believe this is, yeah, in Mirat al-Tullab, he uses a different proof for wajib al-wujud, right? Here in this text, he uses the ayah of the Quran, which is in Surah Al-Hajj. And that ayah of the Quran says that ذلك بأن الله هو الحق, right? And so that's because Allah, He is the truth, is the ayah of the Quran that He uses in this text as a proof. And then in the Mirat al-Tullab, he uses an ayah from Surah Ibrahim, and is part of the ayah, Afillahi shakkun fatir samawati wal ard. You know, is there a doubt that Allah wa ta'ala is the originator of the heavens and the earth? So I find that to be interesting that in that sense, he used a different proof. Now, with regard to there's two names that he uses here. There's some debate over them, in that is al-murid and al-mutakallim. I don't the debate on al-murid is more of a technical debate. Okay, is more of a technical debate, and so is al-mutakallim. Those two names that are they're drawn on in ilm al-kalam, and those debates are coming more from like Ibn Taymiyyah. Aside from that, overall, Shehu Dan Fodio, he makes a strong case, which is actually the case of the scholars of the past. Even Al-Amidi, who is a later day scholar, Ashari scholar of Ilm al-Kalam. Al-Amidi is a very systematic thinker. He makes the case, which some people may not like, but he makes the case for some of the pathways of Ilm al-Kalam being in the Quran itself. Ibn Rushd, the philosopher, he says, القرآن كله إنما هو دعاء إلى النظر والاعتبار والتنبيه على طرق النظر. And this is from مدخل إلى علم الكلام. This is from the introduction or the gateway to علم الكلام by Dr. Hassan al-Shafi'i, was my teacher. He's one of the biggest scholars of ilm al-kalam in Egypt alive. He's pretty up in age at this time. Sometimes he forgets and stuff like that. But even with his forgetting, still he holds some space for that position. He's quoting from Ibn Rushd, who says that the Quran, all of it, is a call to reflection or to nazar and consideration, and it points out the pathways of nazar. And then another is a
Microphone's off.
huh? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
we can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you, Sheikh.
Yes.
So another the ulama, they organize it with the meaning in a very systematic way by definition. The definition is very organized. It's basically like a process that allows you to reach an end. That's where a lot of the debate begins to come in at. That's Ibn Taymiyyah's qualm with the scholars on some fronts, especially the overusage of Aristotelian logic. He wasn't that off in that, to be honest with you. The restricting thinking to only one means of reflection was done. It was done. The unfair point that comes in amongst the critics of the scholars of Kalam and so on and so forth, the unfair point is to not consider that pathway as part of the legacy of the Muslims, the intellectual legacy that we inherit. It's not infallible. It's not a point of infallibility. So it has some ijtihad that. Al-Amadi, he makes the case and he says, like, look, sciences of hadith, the way that they exist today, didn't exist in the time of the Prophet. The same thing with grammar and morphology and rhetoric and usul al-fiqh and all of that. They were just foundations in knowledge. There's a point to that. That has some legitimacy to it. That's why I was talking to you about last week the theory of knowledge. The nadhariyatul ma'rifa. Nadhariyatul ma'rifa. That's an important body of knowledge or investigation or research is extremely important because that's how a lot of this stuff is solved when you start looking at the epistemological front. The epistemological front means the knowledge-based front. And usually the scholars, they refer to usul al-fiqh or the foundations of fiqh as that because they say the foundations of fiqh are the epistemology of the Muslims. But that's not enough. That's why you have some scholars that say al-aslain, and that an aslain is ilm al-aqidah and ilm al-usul al-fiqh. Those two together constitute epistemology. Others say no. Is ilm al-aqidah, usul al-fiqh, and the science of suluk, or some people say tasawwuf. Not everything, of course, in it. The same thing like not everything in ilm al-kalam. Usul al-fiqh remains. Some debate the same thing that they debate on the Aqidah issues. Say not everything. Mostly that's coming from the strong Athari tendency that is rejecting ilm al-kalam. Not all of the Athari tendencies reject ilm al-kalam. But either way, there's agreement that at the core of all of these bodies of knowledge, there's some sort of foundation. So you have thinking about Aqidah issues, which is not only thinking about Allah. Thinking about Aqidah is supposed to be some thought about the human being, about the universe, existence, that type of thing. Usul al-fiqh is much more clear to our purpose because Usul al-fiqh defines what's the source of knowledge how to attain that knowledge, like what's the approach that you have to undertake or employ, what are the principles you have to use for research, and who the researcher is, who the mujtahid as an idea is basically the researcher. Mujtahid as an idea is basically the researcher. So that's important. That's an important concept. So the knowledge base of the Muslims, when we talk about epistemology, what is knowledge, how to attain knowledge, same concept as usul al-fiqh, except the idea of epistemology is the Greek word, right? But the Muslims in today's time, with colonialism and everything like that, they've started to refer more to nadariyatul ma'rifah, because the West gave a lot of importance to epistemology as a discipline, although it was known in the past to the Muslims as well. But the Muslims started to give it importance as well. But it has its own importance. The importance that it has is that part of the debate that we have it over Aqidah, over what minhaj, over approach, has everything to do with not being clear on this topic of nadariyatul ma'rifah, the theory of knowledge or the theory of knowing. They could have called it nadariyatul ilm, but they called it ma'rifah because now you can include ilm, you can include knowledge, and you can include other ways of knowing. That was really intelligent on the part of those that translated the term epistemology as nadariyatul al-ma'rifah. And some say that actually the nadariyatul al-ma'rifah that we have as a concept is a little more less systematic and much more broad than what you see among the non-Muslims. The non-Muslims have a little bit more of a systematic approach towards it. In any event, the scholars of Kalam when we talk about what is knowledge and what is the basis of knowledge, and this issue of nadr, and this issue of reasoning, one of the unfair critiques that comes towards Kalam, and sometimes the scholars of Kalam bring it upon themselves, to be honest with you, is that the Quran does, in many ayat, push us to reflect. Sheikh Dan Fodio, when we read before at the beginning of the text, this is like the second part of the text, the ilahiyat. But in the beginning of the text, he talked about how to deepen our relationship with Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. Does anybody remember that? Did I lose you guys?
I'm listening.
There's a way he was talking about to look at outside the world into the nature.
What did he say?
I said, is a way he was talking about looking outside into the world, into the nature?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. When he brings that up, he's pointing to an approach. Said Nursi develops that pretty well. He wasn't the first to do that. It Hadith and Muhasabi as well. Al-Ghazali has a small book on the create. It's translated nowadays on the creation of man as an individual text. Sheikh uh, Sheikh Amin from Dar al Qasim, he did an introduction to it, where Al-Ghazali looks at the different anatomical parts of the human being, the anatomy of the human being, and how they point to the creation of Allah. Which, by the way, interestingly enough, in the Lum'a, Imam al-Ashari, Abu al-Hasan al-Ashari, who's supposed to be the founder of the Ashari madhab in Aqidah, he doesn't begin with this whole issue of establishing the non-permanence of the creation, or al-alim. Alim is everything that's seen and unseen that's created. He begins with the human being, and we'll come back to that point because it's embedded in what we're saying. So the Quran encourages different pathways to reflect. Sometimes it encourages looking at history. Sometimes it encourages looking at the human development. Sometimes it encourages looking at a particular scenario, which you can make it historical, but let's leave the historical to like civilizations as a whole. Sometimes the Quran will point to, like in the story of Yusuf, interaction between human beings, social dynamics, and psychological dynamics. Even the story of Yusuf is full of all kinds of pathways of reasoning. The Quran is much more expansive than the pathway of ilm al-kalam. Ilm al-kalam for a long time, although it takes its basis to a certain extent as a proof, it justifies itself by saying, well, the Quran pushes us to another. Really, the pathway that they trekked on, or that they traversed, it came mostly from the Mu'tazila, at least in the Ashari school. That's why the later day scholars of Ilm al-Kalam, with this issue of the first thing that's an obligation, another that you have to reflect, or your Aqidah is not sound. That's not the dominant position in the Ashari school, but it does exist in the Ashari school. You know, they say that the first obligation is another, but the Aqidah of the average person is sound. That was their compromise point, because some of the Asharis were not necessarily Ashari in total. They were not necessarily on the madhab of Imam Abu al-Hasan in total. They had their own opinion. And so they were more influenced by the Mu'tazili tendency to obligate people to reason and to take on the reasoning that they lay out, and to use the proofs that they lay out for the existence of God. And if you didn't reason the way that they laid out, then they considered your Aqidah to be problematic. If not, call you a kafir. That exists in the school of thought. But what became dominant was a much more tempered approach. There's no doubt about that. Imam Abu al-Hasan in the Lum'a doesn't take that approach. And Sheikh Hassan al-Shafi'i, Dr. Hassan al-Shafi'i, he mentions some stuff that's extremely important. Most of the books that we have of Imam Abu al-Hasan, rahmatullahi alayhi, for 1,000 years, no work has been done on them by contemporary scholars, for the most part. And not much has been done in the past. Strange enough, a lot of his works have disappeared. Whether that was part of the colonial assault on the Muslims or not, I think there can be some argument made for that. Tangible proofs are not necessarily clear. One of the things that the British Empire did is that it studied extremely well all of the Aqidah groups, translated all of the Aqidah texts that were primary texts, at least at the basic level. I don't know if many of you know that, like, that was the case. And then everybody after the, kind of like followed their lead on that because they were at the forefront. The Spanish were a lot different when they colonized. They would just burn people's stuff up or steal it and just take it to the archives in Rome somewhere. The British, they had their academics that would be at work. We call them the Orientalists, and they studied Aqidah really well. I'm not going to say to the extent that the Muslims master it, but they studied it well. So there's a possibility that they could have picked up on the text and made them disappear. They did that with a lot of other things, a lot of other artifacts in other civilizations, and they put it in museums and so on and so forth. It's possible. A lot of these books are quoted and they lead to the advancement of the Western world. But that's, not like, that's just like an intuition. That's not a well-established position that they stole text. Yes, Mahmoud Shakir in Risalat ila Thaqafatina, which is the treatise clarifying the way to our culture. I should put it like that. That's a loose translation, or on the way to our culture, more literal. The treatise on the way to our culture. He talks about that. He talks about how they stole so many manuscripts from the Muslim world. The only reason I bring that up is because, to me, it doesn't make sense how on earth we're not clear with regard to what happened to the books of Imam Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari. And I mentioned this on a live. I don't know, maybe some of you have heard it. Part of the tafsir of Imam Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari, part of it was 100 volumes. 100 volumes. So they attribute to him 100 books. One of those books is 100 volumes. So imagine how much was written. Only 10 books have survived pretty much, and only a few are talked about out of those 10. My teacher, Dr. Hassan al-Shafi'i, he was asked by Sheikh al-Azhar to teach al-Lum'a. I don't know what happened with that, if he ended up teaching or not. They never recorded it. They recorded the first part, but what happened was that he did publish al-Lum'a. And he said it was a difficult task to teach al-Lum'a. I think he pulled away from teaching it because, as a lot of the scholars from Al-Azhar do, they rely on commentaries and they take a humble approach towards knowledge, in that sense of following up on the scholars of the past said. And there was basically nothing. So he had to create his sub-commentary or his glossary, whatever you want to say. His comments, he had to generate them from research and reflection on the text itself, which he did. And so Imam Abul Hasan, in the theory of knowledge, he begins with the human being. And he begins with the Quranic approach to talking about the development of the human being stage by stage. So he combined 3 sources of knowledge: reflection, the actual development, biological development, and the Quranic text. That was the minhaj of Imam Abul Hasan. at least in that instance. And that's where a lot of Islamic knowledge took its cue from, in bringing the different pathways of knowledge together. That's where some of the critics of ilm al-kalam fall short, because the more you develop this stuff, the more it shows that yes, the Quran is not a book of biology or history or philosophy or language, but it contains all of that. And so in the theory of knowledge, Islamic civilization, and which was represented in this reality, was represented in Al-Andalus, it was represented in Baghdad or Iraq, it was represented in Timbuktu. But I like to use Timbuktu and Al-Andalus as a better example, because at Baghdad you can argue that the Jews were the ones that laid that foundation. But in Timbuktu especially, you see this diverse approach to knowledge. It's not just focusing on Quran, Sunnah, so on and so forth. Part of the dilemma with contemporary Athari Aqidah is that the Quranic methodology is missing. And the Quran is encouraging to another. Part of the issue with the ilm al-kalam students is most of them are just talking. And they're just arguing against the Salafis and that type of thing. But the more difficult task of building the Muslim mind is kind of just set aside. And even some of them overseas are doing the same thing. Very few of them are really building the Muslim mind. They're really preoccupied with the opposition, like a gang type of thing almost. But the work of people like Hamza Bakri, I think it would have been much more beneficial than bringing in Said Fawda, even though Dr. Said Fawda has benefits. And I'm not in a position to judge anyone, but I'm in a position to point out what can be detrimental to the community. The approach is very oppositional. Suraka translated some comments that he made on the Sanusiya, at least the first book of or the second small book of Sanusiya, because there's another book before Al-Muqaddimah. And Nasir Abdul Salam, he translated Al-Bayhaqi with some notes from Bayhaqi's book, Asma'i wa Sifat. Was it Asma'i wa Sifat? No, he didn't. Was it Asma'i wa Sifat? Does anybody know? Or was it the other book of Al-Bayhaqi? He called it. Okay, so no, it wasn't. Yeah, it's Al-I'tiqad wal-Hidayah ila Sabil al-Rashad. You know, it's in a bridge. He abridged it himself, which I don't think he should have abridged that text. It's called Al-I'tiqad and the Guidance to the Mature Way, or the Way of Guidance. It's a play on word, Hidayah and Rashad. Imam al-Bayhaqi, there's no doubt, like Dr. Hamza Bakri mentioned, represents an Athari tendency within the Ash'ari school, which is definitely removed heavily from ilm al-kalam in the sense that is known. Al-Bayhaqi is not delving too deep into that. Neither is Nawawi, neither is Ibn Hajar. So when you start saying these people were from the Ash'ari school, then you should also say that the Ash'ari school has tendencies within it. That's the right way. Whether people like that or not, or they try to make the whole school one, and that's not the case. Dr. Hassan al-Shafi'i, in his book Introduction to Ilm al-Kalam, he admits it. He says it. and he's a great scholar of ilm al-kalam. He's Maturidi and Ashari. He commented on Abu Hassan's book Al-Lum'a. He has taught big books of ilm al-kalam. He's a really well-grounded scholar in philosophy and so on and so forth as well. So that's not a made-up position by the Salafis or the Orientalists. The early Ashari school is a lot different than the later Ashari school. The later Ashari school, beginning with Juwaini and Razi and them, especially Imam al-Razi rahmatullahi alayhi, he overlapped heavily with philosophy. And Dr. Hamza Bakri says, well, look, some of the proofs of the philosophers on some things were stronger than the proofs that we had, that we were using as scholars of Kalam. And so the madhab adjusted it. That's fine from an angle of knowledge. But the people, when you study, you have to understand these things and why these changes take place, why these tendencies emerge. That's why it's important to just have a grasp of epistemology or Nazariyat al-Ma'rifah. You move yourself away from this school against that school. I mean, there's some room for that. But if you don't know what you're talking about, then there's no room for that. You know what I'm saying? And even if you do know what you're talking about, there's still the essence of affirming what's true, what's right, what's possible, what's close, what's near. It's not just a black and white where you're either with us or against us, or you're wrong or you're right. No. Islamic civilization, as long as we separate out the way of the Quran and the Sunnah from the way of reasoning, I'm not saying to make them oppose, but I'm saying as long as we are able to know the difference, the al-isma or infallibility is with revelation. Infallibility is not with human thinking. Maybe possibly we can make the case, because there's some pointing to that as far as evidence, that when the ummah comes to a consensus, that the ummah at that point in time has infallibility. So reasoning is there in the Quran. It's not just one type of reasoning. Some of the scholars of Kalam fell to one type of reasoning. And that's why in this time period, within the last century, people like Al-Maidani, people like Said Nursi and others, they have adjusted. But Said Nursi represents that type of thinking that we were saying before, kind of what Sheikh Uthman is doing here. But Sheikh Uthman is doing it in a very clear way, very brief, because he's building a movement. He's building a movement, he's building scholarship, but he's not trying to write so that his writing is so complicated that you have to spend, years trying to unlock what did the Sheikh say? Possibly he said this, or possibly he means that. Or maybe he said this, or maybe he means that. Then another generation comes and says, no, you guys were wrong. He really meant this. No. Sheikh Uthman is unique. Sheikh Uthman Dan Fodio rahmatullahi alayhi is extremely unique in the world of scholarship. Not only did he follow the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam as is laid down in the Sirah books, and he went from early stage of da'wah to late stage of da'wah and built the whole political, reality for the Muslims. He didn't just build; he built a khalifa. That's some serious stuff. Not only did he do that, but he simplified the pathway to knowledge and clarified and removed the Muslims out of a lot of confusion, whether it's over madhabs or not following madhabs or following a madhab. And the same thing with Aqidah, and the same thing with Tasawwuf. He clarified on all those fronts, and also contemporary issues, which he had nothing to do with the feminist movement or any of these movements. His daughter became, he built women scholars. And we can say that most of that was based on the inspiration of some scholars but the prophetic legacy became the core inspiration. The African Caliphate is a masterpiece, especially Volume 1, in terms of studying his life in a practical way so you gain benefit. Necessary reading to put your mind in place. So with all that we just talked about right now, the reality of this situation is that Shehu Dan Fodio, what he's doing is he's bringing back centrality of the Quran. He's not the only one that does that. Ibn Taymiyyah does that. Sayyid Nursi does that. Shah Wali Allah does that. Mostly anybody, whether we agree with them in total or not, anybody that's moving towards reviving the deen does that. So he separates between the writing of the ulama and the way of the Quran. But he's showing here that when we read tradition, we can find the basis. And there's some truth to that. Although Imam Abul Hassan begins, there's some truth to the way that it is that the later day scholars, they began to deal with some questions, even though they were born from the philosophers, later day scholars of Ilm al-Kalam. This whole idea of starting off with the non-permanence of the world or the non-eternity of the world to prove Allah's existence. To be honest, you look at ayat of the Quran and it talks about how Allah Ta'ala was the one that created the universe. And I just mentioned, the ayat in Surah Ibrahim. The ayat in Surah Ibrahim, it mentioned that reality, that Allah Ta'ala is fatir samawati wal ard. And the Quran is not just saying it. The Quran is pushing us to reflection. How so? The Quran says, "Afillahi shak, afillahi shak." Right. So, is there a doubt with regard to Allah being the one that generated the heavens and the earth, the one that created, the one that began? The heavens and the earth. So that's the 10th ayah. And in one translation, it says in full the whole context. Can there be doubt about Allah, creator of the heavens and the earth? He invites you that He may forgive you of your sins, and He delays your death for a specified term. They said, "You are not but men like us who wish to avert us from what our fathers were worshiping. So bring us a clear authority." So when you look at the context of that whole ayah, this idea brings us a clear authority. Can there be doubt? Defining Allah Ta'ala as the one that is in control of death. Death has a specified term to it, time frame. All that stuff is teachings that in reality are very rational. So to be fair, yes, the scholars of Kalam, many of them went to excesses. They began that Dr. Hassan Shafi says the same thing. There's a tendency that was heavily influenced by philosophy. There was a tendency that began to, like Imam al-Ghazali. Imam al-Ghazali, rahmatullahi alayhi, as much as he pushed for reason people, he himself at the end of the day, he himself at the end of the day, he gave personal experience with Allah Ta'ala highest role in knowledge of who Allah is. And that led to other movements, and other debates in Islamic thought, like the whole idea of Zawq, he wasn't the only one. He wasn't the originator of the idea, but the idea of Zoq is that you taste, that you have a personal experience. You experience it. You taste it. Sheikh al-Albani was against that concept of Zoq. Mu'allim al-Yamani was for it. Even within the later day Salafi slash Athari, whatever trend, you have some debates about that as a pathway to knowledge. That's why we said Nadhariyat al-Ma'rifah is an important subject. The understanding the pathways to knowledge, to knowing, that's an important subject. It removes you from a lot of the debates, and you begin to see that these discussions, you frame them in a bigger frame. Sheikh Uthman, for us, he clarified the way in this text, and he's showing us, like, look, slow yourself down. We can show you the basis of the Quran, and we can even criticize some of the way of the ulama. But they're not totally off. But they also don't get the same position as or standing or ranking as the book and the Sunnah. I personally, I think that is a very beneficial approach. I think that it's an approach that has a lot of maturity to it. It gives room for some discussion. I'm used to that among the scholars. Less hostile approach towards other schools and a more open discussion. That's kind of how I have studied and appreciating the different tendencies or schools that exist. And that's what he does. You know what I'm saying? That's what he does. Any questions? Anything that needs to be clarified?
I had posted a question earlier. I think I already know the answer, but I wanted to make sure that when you talk about knowledge and the basis of knowledge, is that what you're referring to in regards to epistemology?
Yeah. Epistemology basically is summed up in saying, like, what is knowledge? What constitutes knowledge? What are the sources of knowledge? How do you achieve it? Mostly all the books in Ilm al-Kalam, even Ibn Taymiyyah in Usul al-Tafsir, and of course in other books, he has written tons of books. They all agree, Quran, Sunnah, sound reasoning, but they say for Sunnah, they say the transmission of a trustworthy person as a way to know, and then they add sense knowledge. And the reason why the Muslims went so heavy into Greek philosophy is because Aristotle, especially Aristotle, he focused a lot on knowledge beginning in the senses, which is actually a Quranic position. The Quran tells us to reflect on the universe. The opposite of Aristotle was Plato, and Plato's reasoning was that what you see, there's a foundation behind it. So a tree, you see a tree in a particular form, but no, the idea of tree exists. That's why you can have tons of trees, because the idea of tree is real from behind the scenes. So they liked that. The scholars had liked that because it gave them like a pathway to reasoning and reflecting. But it has its own problems because the language, those ideas come from a different language. And there has been a debate for so long amongst the people of the book in general about how to deal with Greek philosophy, whether it was the Christians or whether it was the Jews, the Muslims as well. Everyone has debated, how do you deal with this alien culture, this Greek culture? The other issue that comes into play is that in modern society, there's a complete break from Greek understanding of things. And that's why there's a lot of tension between the Christians and the Jews and the Muslims. Because the Muslims didn't abandon and complete some of the more earlier positions on thinking and so on and so forth. And in Ilm al-Kalam, there's a principle, people, that if you're the basis of your ethics or your morality is solely reasoning, that at the end of the day you're going to permit everything. That's a statement, is a principle in Ilm al-Kalam. Right. Al-Ibahiyya, they call it. Al-Ibahiyya, like Ibah, Mubah. Everything will be made permissible. And there's truth to that. When without naql, or without wahi, without revelation, without Quran and Sunnah, and for the Christians and the Jews, their books, even though they have their issues, if it's just all reasoning, at the end of the day, it's gonna come to a point of just unlimited permissibility to a great extent in the realm of personal morality. On the social level, I don't know. I mean, these questions are very important questions. There's high level stuff here. Because the Ashari school in this front, in somewhat they failed, in my opinion. It's my opinion. I'm more with the Maturidi school and Ibn Taymiyyah in that regard. That reason can determine some sense of right or wrong. And one of the reasons why is this is a big issue in Ilm al-Kalam. The role of the mind, the reasoning, and determining right or wrong or good and bad. And the reason why is because we live in a society where sometimes, let's be honest about the society, like it has its problems, but sometimes if a scientific study will come about, or some process of reasoning, like say for instance, if we figure out that if you go at 55 miles per hour in a 25-mile zone with a lot of curve, that's going to cause a lot of accidents and deaths. So they'll shut it down. You know, they'll shut it down. They'll do it. Sometimes it could be from learning from experience. Sometimes it could be from a test drive or whatever, you know, a test crash type of thing, or testing the highways. So we see that in the living, that reason can determine some right or wrong. You don't need an actual text from the Quran and Sunnah for every instant. You can operate with general principles from the Quran. So there, Ibn Taymiyyah and the Ashari in the Maturidi school, they have a basis. The Ashari school is understandable what they were aiming at. They were arguing with the Mu'tazila, who were going to an extreme, so they went to the opposite extreme to defend the Quran and the Sunnah. Yeah, that's why we have to understand these things in their proper context, or else, you know, we won't respect anybody. You know, it's okay to be a little liberal with your Muslim brothers and sisters. That doesn't mean you agree with everything. You know what I'm saying? But give the benefit of the doubt to some degree. It doesn't mean that you're gonna agree with everything, but there's reasons why some of these positions develop, and that's why looking at all of this stuff from the angle of the theory of knowledge is much more beneficial, because then you have much more room. Shaukani himself was strongly in Athari in Aqidah, but he was not opposed to Ilm al-Kalam, and he actually had a rule in Ilm al-Kalam. And one of the things that he had pushed was that when you look at the schools, don't judge truth by a school. This is Ashari, so it's the Haq. This is Athari, so it's the Haq. This is Maturidi, so it's the Haq. This is Imami or Zaydi or Mu'tazili, so it's the Haq. No, he said, he was bold, he was radical. He said, no, look at the evidence. Look at the evidence. If the evidence is strong for the position, then you run with it. Of course, that's not some low-level student of knowledge type stuff. So you have to begin from somewhere, and then that's when you come back to these. I'm following this school or that school. But the point being is that in many ways, his conclusion, is much more strong. And in the book that Shehu Dan Fodio wrote is called فتح البصائر لتحقيق وضع العلوم البواتن والظواهر. So the opening of insight in realizing, the position or the role of the inner and outer sciences. Sheikh Uthman Dan Fodi, in the theory of knowledge, if you pick up on his language, that's what he's doing. He's saying there's knowledge, there's inner knowledge, outer knowledge. He uses that constantly. We know that those terms are used, but he uses that constantly. In this book, he talks about these types of things, like the role of evidence, the role of the mujtahid, that type of thing. He in some of his books, he talks a little bit about the person that has some knowledge and the madhabs. Do you have to follow the madhab closely or not? What's sufficient? That those were the discussions that were taking place in his time period. And now, kind of, we went to an extreme with the last 100 years, where everybody's calling back to the Quran and the Sunnah. And part of it was because the tradition before, people got stuck with the tradition. Not to say that the scholars were always stuck. No, but the general masses were stuck. The tradition became too complicated for them to understand. Technical writing, and then a lot of times, especially understanding hadith, widespread worldwide, there was deficiency in understanding hadith. That's why a lot of the tendency went towards hadith. Is not just a so-called Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab trend. Allah have mercy on him, but it was much more than that. Shah Allah, rahmatullahi alayhi, he had taken the knowledge of hadith from al-Hijaz to the subcontinent. You had movements in Sham, the same thing. And you had movements in Timbuktu. You had movements later on in Egypt. Ahmed Shakir and Ahmed Shakir. Before Ahmed Shakir, it was Rashid Rida. Rashid Rida and Muhammad Abdu. Rashid Rida had a magazine called Al Manar, and they were publishing, calling the people to hadith. That heavily influenced Sheikh Al-Albani. Although Sheikh Al-Albani, his students won't always admit that, but there was different groups, different tendencies. Then later on, during Sheikh Al-Albani's time, the Ghumari brothers, especially Abdul Aziz and Abdullah, they were from Morocco. And they were not the only ones. There was tons. So this was, and the Ghumari family, you had different Aqidah tendencies. That's why sometimes in the Ghumari family, they say there's confusion. So it was not just like some sort of petrodollar conspiracy. No, people were trying to figure out, what did we do wrong? How can we correct ourselves? How can we gain hidayah? How can we gain guidance? That's what the Muslims were doing. And you had different responses to the political reality that the Muslims were in. This was one response. Sheikh Uthman Dan Fodio's response was one response. People ask, well, how can he establish a khilafah? There was already a khilafah with the Ottoman Empire. Well, the Ottoman Empire, in reality, it didn't always have a strong hand on everything. And they left that part of Africa to somewhat chaos. They were not able to manage that. By that time period, if they didn't make the moves that they made, look, it would have been a serious issue. It was already a problem. Al-Andalus collapsed. They lost Al-Andalus. Al-Andalus was not only Spain, was Granada and all those places as well. And that portion, that region of the world was in chaos between Morocco and Spain. The French were invading, Morocco invaded Timbuktu. The Muslims were fighting each other. And then you had which in this text sometimes is brought up in the notes, you had the transatlantic slave movement. Muslims were being enslaved. You have all these scholars coming into the Americas from this type of stuff. And so Islam in that part, for a long time, nobody was able to penetrate West Africa. West Africa was not colonized. The warriors in West Africa were fierce. So Islam entered West Africa through piety. It's much different than East Africa. The Omanis, the Ibadis, Tanzania, and all those places, they laid those places to waste. They laid those places to waste. Right? So the Muslims were struggling. So these were all responses, that you see these different movements, including the movement of Sheikh Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. It was a response, to the problems of the day. Somebody asked the question, should one learn epistemology? Epistemology is extremely important. Extremely important. Said, should one learn epistemology at a primer level to better help their studies and better understand the minds of the writers of books and so on? Yeah, that it's important. Epistemology is important, but first you begin with the epistemology of the Muslims. There's a book called The History of Islamic Philosophy by Majid Fakhri. Although he lends heavy to philosophy, he did a generally decent job. There's another book called The History of The History of Muslim Philosophy by M.M. Sharif. All of that stuff is PDF. Those books are important. They give you kind of like the history of the different Aqidah schools and so on and so forth. But the epistemology of the Muslims is found, for instance, in that book that I posted, Fawz al-Kabir. Part of it is found there. Part of it is found in the basics of the sciences of Hadith, Usul al-Fiqh. So all the Usul, like Usul al-Fiqh, Usul al-Hadith, even Usul al-Aqidah, Usul al-Tafsir, even the Arabic language, we get a lot of our epistemology from there. And of course, there's some books that have been written as well, have been translated on the basics of logic as it was understood by the Muslims. That's where you start getting your foundation from to kind of understand how the Muslims were dealing with knowledge. But the source of all knowledge is the Quran. The Quran needs study. The way of the Quran, the methodology of the Quran, the foundation of knowledge in the real sense. Asl al-usul. The first book, I believe it was History of Islamic Philosophy by Majid Fakhri. There's actually another book, I'll post it. that deals with this topic, Nazariyat al-Mahifa, in a more contemporary, systematic way, is by McLawi. I'll post it. He's dealing with contemporary issues and past issues. That book is good. Louis Toffee has another one. It's called The Foundation of Knowledge as well. Those are more contemporary treatments of this stuff where you get a little bit of everything. Louis Toffee's book is good, but it needs a teacher on some parts of it. Some parts of it can be understood without a teacher. And I believe there's a PDF for that as well. I'll put some of these books out there. But this is where the scholars are at, people. Don't you may this type of discussion is where what the scholars are discussing. This is not a discussion that the general du'at, people doing da'wah and stuff like that, they're not necessarily discussing this type of stuff because some of them are not high level. I mean, Allah forgive me for saying that, but it's very true. Some of the people that are, are out there, are not always just transmitting what the scholars are saying in a way that they're thinking out. How is it going to have an impact on the community? They're just arguing from the points of whatever scholars that they follow in an opposition way. But the scholars that are concerned with the state of the ummah and the social problems of the ummah and all that, they're more on this type of stuff. They're more on moving away from the back and forth and trying to clear the Muslim mind, build the Muslim mind up. There's the book Crisis of the Muslim Mind as well. Crisis of the Muslim Mind is a good book to read. It talks about the absence of methodology, the problem of methodology in today's time among the Muslims. If there's no more questions, we can end with that. Inshallah, we'll begin with the section on Nubuwah. Try to take notes of this audio. Everyone try to make their own notes because there's stuff that has been said here that's extremely foundational for you. Especially on the pathways of ilm al-kalam. Some of the foundation for it, some of the criticism for it, and the techniques of Shehu Dan Fodio as well. I'll try to make a list of the books that I mentioned and upload what I can. So.
Barakallah feek, Sheikh.
والعصر إن الإنسان في خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. وعليكم السلام وفيكم بارك.
Alaikum. Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.